All right, everybody, today we're going to look at Chapter 3 of the book Consilience, where Dr. Wilson will kind of lead us through a walkthrough of the Enlightenment period. And he actually is going to kind of give us an idea of the major modes of thinking in Western civilization from about the 17th century to modern day, and kind of the modes of thinking that most consistently have led the predominant thoughts in society. Again, from about the 18th, 17th, 18th century and on. At the end of the chapter, Wilson gives a critique of postmodern thinking or postmodernity that if you're a fan or a follower of Dr. Peterson, or if you know anything about Dr. Peterson's loathing and understanding of postmodernism, you'll find an answer to that critique here. It'll also be interesting to any of my followers or any of my people who are watching who are familiar with Jung. In the Jungian world right now, two of the most interesting volumes on the Red Book have been released as collections of essays called the Red Book for Our Time, searching for the soul under postmodern conditions. For those people who have read that, the ending is a critique of postmodernity. The other thing that I'd like to do today is, as this video continues, is to focus on where consilience and specifically Enlightenment thinking, calling for consilience, could be a mode forward for all of the people who are walking away, who have rationally observed kind of the cracks in the way that leftists or progressives, one of the ways that they are thinking, or some of the ways that they're thinking, that drives people away from that mode of politics. So in my opinion, this chapter on the Enlightenment, drawing us back to Enlightenment thinking, the search for consilience or the unity of knowledge, is a great message and a great pathway, a great strategy forward for anybody who has just recently walked away. So we're going to outline the dominant forms of thinking, and then critique postmodernism for what it does for our society today. So kind of just an outline thinking of what happened during the Enlightenment period. It was a vision of secular knowledge in the service of human rights and progress, and it was the West's greatest contribution to civilization. Wilson also says it launched the modern era for the entire world, and he gets into that. He gets into what an understanding of science, specifically reductionist Newtonian thinking, thinking of Descartes, breaking things down in three dimensions and understanding them, how that led to the West progressing further and faster, catching up with the East, and then progressing further and faster. But somehow the Enlightenment failed, and it's in that failing that we should be searching now. Like, why did it fail? How did it fail? And what do we need to do to make sure that it doesn't fail again? Just a couple of ideas or thoughts on what Enlightenment is, and kind of thinking about why it failed and then how it failed. One of these things, when you view Enlightenment different depending on whether you're talking about the Enlightenment of Western thinking, the Descartes, the Bacons, the philosophers of this time period, and Enlightenment in terms of Eastern philosophy and Eastern thinking. Those two terms mean certainly two different things. But one of the things I'm interested in is this kind of question of, if Enlightenment really is a thing, whether you're talking about Western Enlightenment or unity of knowledge based on science, or you're talking about Eastern Enlightenment in terms of, let's just say simply being at peace with oneself. Why aren't more people enlightened? That's something that's a question that I'm very interested in, regardless of which one of those you're talking about. But Wilson specifically is talking about the Enlightenment, Enlightenment in terms of the period of the 17th and 18th century thinkers. So we need to know what the essential nature of the Enlightenment was, and we need to know the weakness that brought it down. And both of those, in Wilson's eye, can be wrapped up in the life of the Marquis de Condorcet, and I in full, just from my just for my kind of personal explanation, I'm not a philosophy or an Enlightenment guy. I mean, learning about these things, reading about these men, Newton is somebody obviously I know, but most of my studies were in biology, and so these Enlightenment, these physics, these science mathematician figures are their ideas. I can't readily place them, or I couldn't readily place them before I read this book, and so that's one of the reasons it was so important for me to kind of look at these. So I had never really looked into the life of the Marquis de Condorcet, but he was one of the last great French philosophers who really dove into the political landscape. He really got into the political landscape towards the end of the Revolution, or towards the beginning of the Revolution. So he had to he saw the Revolution, and he had to control. He had to see the control of its demonic forces. I thought that was an interesting line that Condorcet did. He was the only philosopher, again, to see the Revolution take place. He was liberal to the bone in the line of Locke and then other contemporary thinkers like Paine and Kant. His ideas were kind of centered around the mind being molded wholly by the environment. This idea that if you could have the perfectibility of human nature, and he was an ethicist. He was an ethicist by thinking that all of humanity can be united in kind of how they were thinking and what they were thinking, and that driving them forward. Kind of all that being said, he was a humanitarian. He was a humanitarian who wanted to see politics lessened as a source of power and a means of implementing lofty moral principles. That's kind of was his focus. So a very progressive thinker. He was from a line of the aristocracy, so he was from money. He was well educated. Most of the people in his family went on to be religious scholars, religious thinkers, but he kind of chose this path of science and enlightenment, and kind of fell into the path of Voltaire and some of the great French thinkers, pre-revolutionary thinkers. So that was this. He was this great social thinker in the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary France. So what happened to him? Well, he died in a jail cell because his views were too moderate and too reasonable. So this Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet, he had always pushed against partisan politics, but somehow he got caught up in it, and he was charged. He was charged in the great the great French Inquisition. He was charged with political crimes, and he was mobbed and mauled by villagers who knew he was on the run for his views, and those villagers would have surely turned him into the Parisian authorities. But kind of what happened was this general will idea that Rousseau had put forward 30 years before, who kind of said, he coined that phrase, general will, said that the rule of justice agreed upon by the assemblies of free peoples, whose interest is only to serve the welfare of the society and each person in it. That makes a contract that is always constant, unalterable, and pure. You follow the direction of the general will, and you receive your part as a section of the whole. Rousseau concluded, those who do not conform to the general will are deviants and subject to necessary force by the assembly. One of the things that comes to my mind is, that idea of a contract, and this is one of the things that thinking that is broken down when we're trying to talk about human behavior and kind of agreeing with human behavior. One of this idea of a contract versus a covenant is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. In the trust of humanity, can you really trust a contract? Contracts are all words. And when something is all words, it's not grounded in action. But covenant is something that is grounded and rooted in something deeper. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently in terms of increasing human trust relationships with my students and the parents of the athletes and the students that I teach and coach. So anyway, this idea of general will was put forth by the radical Jacobean leftist group that was prominent in France at the time. So Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet, the Jacobeans put their practice of general will and enforced that on the Marquis de Condorcet for his views. That was necessary force. You saw that necessary force play out in Europe over the next couple of years. Wilson talks about the demagogues ask only for unity of purpose on behalf of virtue. Kind of this idea of, if your eggs must be broken to make an omelet. Tyrants from Napoleon to Stalin use the same reasoning of political, to fight political opposition, and in doing that, they really made some attacks on reason. It's this pathway of people moving beyond the original intention of the meaning. So this Enlightenment that had brought all these ideas that the Marquis de Condorcet was proposing and fighting for, which really helped propel society forward, were taken to extremes for different reasons. The true goal of the Enlightenment was never kind of felt. The true goal of the Enlightenment wasn't something that was very united. And one thing, you pack that into Condorcet when he talks about the sole foundation for the belief in the natural sciences, the idea that general laws, both known and unknown, are necessary and constant. Why should this principle be any less true for the development of the intellectual and moral faculties of man than for the operations of nature? The true purpose of the Enlightenment was unity. It was unity of all knowledge, this consilience idea that E.O. Wilson is talking about. The purpose of the Enlightenment was to bring all branches of learning together. And instead, we see that kind of idea has a dark side. And that dark side, no matter what good is in the original idea, all human ideas are going to fail, because at the end of the day, humans are, they have a tendency to take hierarchies, have a tendency to fall into tyranny, even thought hierarchies. And so that's kind of what we saw play out with the Marquis de Condorcet. He wrote his masterwork, A Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind, from a boarding house as he was kind of fleeing from his political trouble. So kind of how did all of this happen? Well, around the 1500s, before the Enlightenment started, kind of what got the Enlightenment going was this kind of understanding, or this kind of push from science, that people studying science or doing the scientific processes over and over and over again, we're noticing that the cosmos is orderly, that it can be measured and arranged into hierarchies, and we've noticed that throughout time. You see the systems and the mechanisms and forces, and you can outline the world as God's machine if you can't really push forward without the idea of divinity. So if this idea of finding things or understanding reason or consciousness is a defining trait of humanity, kind of what happened to make sure it didn't take? If science is moving us forward, kind of where did it go wrong? Well, you've kind of got to understand at the beginning of this where Bacon kind of comes in. He draws the spirit of the original Enlightenment thinking probably better than anybody else. When he looked at all possible modes of thought, Bacon concluded that induction was the best method of investigation. Just kind of a reminder on this idea of induction. I covered this in I think it was my first lecture over chapter 1. When looking at all possible thoughts, he said induction was the best method of investigation. And induction is trying to derive by reason to lead to something, a conclusion or an inference, or to suggest and imply. It's the process of inferring a general law or principle from observation of particular instances. Now, Bacon wasn't necessarily a gifted scientist or mathematician like some of the great people we'll study after this, the great Enlightenment thinkers that we'll look at after this. He's certainly no Isaac Newton, but he's kind of known as the philosopher of science, the father of induction. He saw the entire picture of science in a much different way than we perceive it now. And this is interesting again because one of the things he was a taxonomist. So he kind of had this biological basis of things. He was very interested in ideas of taxonomy. But he saw science in a much different way. He said to get maximum objectivity, we must entertain minimum preconceptions. All of the knowledge was his province. So he envisioned a disciplined and unified learning kind of as a key to improving the human conditions. And I love this right here, is that he believed that science should be poetry and poetry should be science. Bacon thought all branches of learning were open-ended and constantly evolving, but he rejected this notion of that those branches, there were division among those branches. He rejected divisions among those branches kind of wholeheartedly. He said nature and her secrets must be as stimulating to the imagination as poetry and fables. He also understood kind of that these limitations have our limitations of understanding. Bacon really had a good grasp on, and this is something that I think, again, when you start talking about the people who are in walk away, you're going to recognize in what I'm about to say from Bacon's thinking that causes people to walk away. You're going to see in Bacon's thinking what's driving people away from the left. These are his idols of the mind. So Bacon really had this kind of wish to reform reasoning across all branches of learning. He had this idea that the mind was not like this wax tablet. He said on a tablet you can write, you cannot write the new until you erase the old. He said of the mind, you can't wipe away the old except by writing in the new, and that's something very interesting to think about. So kind of these idols of the mind, these idols of the mind were something that Bacon said he noticed in all undisciplined thinkers. So anybody who's thinking in an undisciplined way falls prey to one of these idols of the mind. The first idol is the idol of the tribe, where you assume more order than exists in chaotic nature. There's just this assumption that if I go back to my tribe, if I kind of go back to my tribe, then it's all orderly, it's all fine if I base all of my emotions and my thoughts on just the tribe. He talked about the idols of the cave, the idiosyncrasies of individual and passionate thinking towards one thing. So you just put yourself in this cave and you hold yourself there in your thinking. He talked about the idol of the marketplace, where the power of words to induce belief in non-existent things really kind of draw people into thinking in a way that's not productive. And then finally, the idols of theater, the unquestioning acceptance of philosophical beliefs and misleading demonstrations. Bacon kind of lays out, and I think it's very interesting. He uses this term idols, things that you essentially can worship that are not fulfilling, that are not complete, that by their nature are just parts of a whole, are just a small part of a whole. It's a very interesting term for anybody who knows or studies any theology, which we'll get to in a moment. You really need to stay clear of these idols and observe the world around you as it truly is, and reflect the best means of transmitting that reality as you have experience. And Bacon calls us to kind of put every fiber of your being into transmitting the best of that reality. So this is the understanding of enlightenment that E.O. Wilson is working with. This unity of knowledge. It's not what I'm about to explain, but it's taking science and art and kind of bringing them together. That's what he's talking about when he's talking about consilience, and he's kind of laying out the fact that the negatives of the Enlightenment, or what came next in the Enlightenment, and what the Enlightenment is known for, that kind of ended it, is not the original intention. And I think there's an important part of that. So Wilson next is going to take you from Descartes to Newton. He writes a line here that is another grasp at consilience with Jung, and I find this very interesting because he says all histories that live in our hearts are peopled by archetypes in mythic nature, and that's why Bacon endures. So before he explains this Newtonian idea of thinking, this reductionist materialist thinking that if you have a spiritual sense to you, if you have a religious sense to you, go listen to Paul Vanderklay talk about these ideas. He does a very good job explaining these, because this is kind of the crux. What we're about to talk about is what we see, or what I see as the problematic nature in humans' general thinking pattern. And I use thinking very lightly there. So all histories are lived in our hearts and peopled by archetypes in the mythic nature, and that's why Bacon endures. So again, talking about my walk away people, Bacon is the call to adventure that learners could be called to the mapping of the terrain of the unknown. So this political landscape that we're currently inhabiting is very similar to the unknown, as people are trying to figure out how to break away from a political party who is really driving the idol of the tribe, among other things. The idols of, again, the other idols, the idols of the theater as well. Kind of people who have see this undisciplined thinking that permeates our society. And we're going to talk about kind of how that plays out in thinking in a Newtonian manner, or only thinking in a Newtonian manner is what I should say. So Descartes was the greatest of all the French philosophers. He was the first thinker to really pick up the call to adventure from Bacon. And Descartes showed how to do science by deduction. So instead of that induction, instead of creating this consilience, Descartes showed us how to do science very well and very fast based on deduction. He in his three-dimensional world, that he claimed that our perceptions could be framed in those three coordinates, and that essentially kind of is what the algebra and the geometry that he showed could be reduced to, because his goal was kind of to cut to the quick of every phenomenon and skeletonize it. He's the one who's going to say, Descartes is the one who's going to coin the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," and introduce this idea of, or really kind of popularize this idea of systematic doubt. So kind of reductionism in this analytical mathematical modeling has really molded modern science. This is where we've kind of hit our biggest stride, because Newton really picked up that mantle and kind of flew with it. He is the inventor of calculus, and because of his understanding of calculus, which I would say is very related to his understanding of alchemy, which, if you want a good little rabbit hole of you need to look up Sir Isaac Newton, The Last Magician, which is something my friend Skip shared with me recently. And again, if you're a Jungian, you'll know Dr. Jung stopped his Red Book writing to pursue alchemy and pursue his understanding of alchemy, which led to a lot of his great discoveries. But anyway, Newton gave us calculus, and so our understanding of the mathematical techniques and the abstractions that we could pull from science to abstract something out so we could see it and touch something that was unknown. That's what math is able to do to something that has been reduced to something you can put in mathematically. And that's what led to the consilience of physics, chemistry, parts of biology, and economics. Kind of those ideas of reducing and skeletonizing that Newton kind of learned by learning Descartes. And he talked about the geometry that he learned from Descartes really driving his ability to give us calculus. That answered a lot of the questions of the unknown. I'm going to get this wrong, but in the book there's a quote that's something about God said, "Let there be light," and He gave us Newton, or something along those lines. This is where this is the start to our understanding of quantum mechanics that gave us our technology that we have. But kind of one of the things that's interesting about this is this mode of thinking leads you down to this thought that our species and its way of thinking are a product of evolution, not the purpose. And that's something to keep in mind. That's something to keep in mind, because that's a very important statement. Our ability, but Newton gave us our ability to solve problems and then understand those problems because we had a better abstract representation with the math. Our understanding of the natural world kind of as a result of those deductions, being able to deduce and then show, really kind of caught us up with the Western civilization, caught us up with the science of the Chinese and the Eastern cultures. Newton's kind of first things, if were messing with prisms, and how light kind of works. He demonstrated the relation of the refractability of light to color, and of that compound nature of the sunlight that kind of helped us understand the origin of the rainbow. So he understands these principles, he learns these principles, he's able to put the math to them, and from that, based on that, by 1684, Newton had given us the laws of gravity, and then 3 years later, the laws of motion. And again, it's one of the things I want to point out here, this word law. It's in the 1600s that we get laws for the first time, really since Moses came down from the Ten Commandments. This is something top down that we can all understand and grasp and hold to. So this universe, this idea gave this universe not only order but kind of an intelligence. It made it intelligible. You could know it. You could know it. You can understand it because in this search for a Newtonian explanation of things, you're given something that you can see. You're given light. So kind of what happens next is this idea of Newtonian thinking. It was finally applied to humanity. It's finally applied to an understanding of humanity, and it's that really that kind of gave birth to sociology. It's that gave this birth to understanding the science of who we are, and this reductionist thinking. That enabled the West to catch up with our and surpass, like I said before, surpass the Eastern thinkers, the Eastern scientists. It gave us an increase in that ability, but when applied to human behavior, when applied to societal understanding, one of the things that we need to point out is it has some pretty glaring weaknesses. And those glaring weaknesses and the strengths of it have been kind of playing this back and forth in what I'm calling kind of the rest of the story. So once we got to post-Newton, where we start breaking things down the way we're breaking things down now, we try to figure out everything in a reductionist manner and skeletonize it. You can see this in society with Twitter. That's a great explanation of Twitter. The Descartes, I think, therefore I am, is a great explanation of Twitter, because everybody on Twitter says that at least the people who actually post their thoughts, they're putting their thoughts out there and they're saying, I think, therefore I am. And when you look at the vile part of Twitter, the tribalistic part of Twitter, you see lots of I think, therefore I am. I think this, and that puts you here, or that puts me here in this one spot, this reductionist spot. And again, in my opinion, that's what's causing so many people to walk away. It doesn't do it so much from the right, but that's probably a personality difference. And anyway, just kind of guessing on that. But we also really at this point get into this deism versus theism kind of idea. In the West, that's where the Descartes and the Newtonian and the Enlightenment led us to. It led us to this deism versus theism, because Judeo-Christianity is rooted in kind of two things: reason and revelation. And deism is always going to kind of give the upper hand to reason, and religion is always going to kind of give the upper hand to revelation. And in a lot of ways, we're kind of stuck there today. We're kind of stuck there, and Wilson kind of lays out why. One of the reasons why, and he focuses mostly on the deism, is, in his opinion, deism is not rational. It's emotional. Pure reason is ultimately unappealing because it's kind of bloodless in a way, and there's no sacrifice required. It requires no submission, and because of that, It's kind of interesting. Ceremonies don't have the same meaning because they don't have the connection to a higher order of being. There's no surrender to a benevolent being, kind of like I talked about a while ago. And if there's no surrender, there's no substitute for a higher life force that drives you to this leap of faith and this bringing of transcendence. It's why we don't have, one of the questions that I ask myself is, why don't we have kind of the same cool induction ceremonies anymore? The kind of coming of age ceremonies, and there's an interesting, talking about the Red Book, the collection of essays, the Red Book for Our Time. In volume 2, there's an essay that Skip Conover on the Jungian Reading Group channel goes through that talks about ceremony and the why we don't have ceremony anymore. Well, there's no higher order of being, so ceremony and kind of bringing people into this society don't have the same meaning, because there's nothing more higher. There's nothing higher than us that we are all kind of ascribing to. It's an interesting thought. So deism and science. Okay, the other problem is, those two things can't colonize ethics. This is just something that deism has not had the ability to do. Now, biology is going to play a role in that, and this is where the natural sciences can come back in, because this is one of the things that Dr. Peterson talks about. Jacques Pincept, who in affective neuroscience talked about emergent morality in rats. This is a very interesting study, because it shows that, and we know this now, if you know evolutionary biology, we know about these ideas of reciprocal altruism and cooperating strategies, and kind of where do those emerge from, and are they embedded into our biology in any way, which is an important thing to know. It's something that's it's very important, because deism, this ideas of deism and reductionist thinking of the human nature, they can't get a grasp on ethics, and that's what you see a lot of right now. That discussion is happening, I think, tonight with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, which is very interesting to note. Again, once you kind of break that. Once you kind of break that deism, theism, you could view that as kind of Enlightenment versus postmodernism. You could view that as Enlightenment versus postmodernism, and kind of dwindles down to that. Postmodernism is going to say we can know really nothing. There is nothing great to know. Whereas the Enlightenment proposed by Bacon says we can know everything. And that, obviously the reductionist scientists are trying to do that too. They're just so busy breaking things down that they haven't started putting them back together yet. So kind of this is where, and I put this in jest, E.O. Wilson kind of destroys postmodernism. If I was going to make a video over that, this is where this would come from, E.O. Wilson destroying postmodernism, although he's a lot nicer to it than Dr. Peterson. This is kind of his interpretation of postmodernism, is reality being in a state constructed by the mind, not perceived. There are no real objective truths, just versions you can have based on your group, and no group is better in any of their expressions of truth or morality, because each group is special in its own way. This leads to equality and multiculturalism, because it gives ethnic groups and different sexual preferences and all the other broken down groups in every community equal validity. It also kind of gives reason to implement the strategies with communal with communal support into education, just because it exists. This premise has to be correct. Or you are a racist or a bigot or a sexist or something else, because you are misogynist, because you don't attribute everything to that group. This is kind of this is their cardinal rule, which of course if you say it's the cardinal rule or you act like it's the cardinal rule, then you're really going back on your original thinking, since there is supposed to be no great universal truth. And the problem of this reductionist way of thinking, which is what this is, I mean, it's still reductionism, is you see kind of the Rousseau, that you see Rousseau reemerging, the general will idea of these groups. And again, if you understand human behavioral biology, and psychology in any way, you see the struggle with thinking this way, or you see the potential negativity in thinking this way, because Rousseau will reemerge, this general will to protect and to drive towards the group or the tribe's goal. Seeing this really is scary. Kind of Wilson then, he attacks Derrida a little bit. I say attacks. Wilson's such a Southern gentleman. He's very nice to them in his attack. He takes on Derrida and there being nothing outside of the text and the interpretation problem that we're facing in the social sciences, in the way that we think. He moves on to Foucault. And he talks about Foucault's observations on power. And in Foucault's observations on power, he does quote somebody. He says, Foucault was grappling with the deepest and most intractable dilemmas of modern identity. If there's no God or no natural law or transcendent reason exist outside, and he recognized how materialist interest of power had corrupted people in powerful positions in every previous morality. Foucault made some observations. Now, I'd say those observations are, you don't really have to look very hard to see what Foucault saw, and to see the problem with what Foucault saw. But the question is, if that's your reductionist reality, how do you live with that? If everything in the world is based on power, and then the power is only based within the group, the answer, if that is just the worldview, the only worldview, then we're in trouble. We're in trouble because the answers to that problem are problematic. They always have been. And we saw it with Rousseau. We saw it in the 20th century. We saw it with the Nazis. We saw it with the communists. We saw it with the parts of the power that Foucault pointed out that are wrong. But the issue comes not from the reduction elements, but with this idea of consilience and connecting things and moving things forward. Wilson claims that there are two types of original thinkers: those who see disorder and then try to create order, and those who see order and protest it by seeing disorder. And it's kind of on these lines that Wilson kind of gives his critique on postmodernism that I wanted to focus on. I found this very interesting. Again, he says the line between chaos and order drives learning forward, which is something that is conciliant with what Dr. Peterson says in Maps of Meaning. The tension between the two is real and necessary. It's the uniting of opposites. In the Jungian sense, this idea of taking what you know and what you don't know and joining them together. He says both are necessary. He says both are necessary. Both those two ways of thinking are necessary, and that means chaos and order are necessary. They're not opposites. They're co-relatives. They're coexistent. They're the yin and the yang, if you need to see it that way. So this is where Dr. Peterson might could learn, and I think he is learning from E.O. Wilson. He says, postmodernists have enriched our culture. They say to us, maybe you're wrong. He says their ideas are like sparks from fireworks, explosions that travel in all directions but are devoid of the following energy, and because of that they will go out. but some of these fireworks endure long enough to cast light on unexpected subjects. So just because they are a menace to rational thinking doesn't mean you don't use it. It's what you use to strengthen our real organized knowledge. And so he kind of ends with, in the end, he says this is the beauty of postmodern thought. That it's if from a biological perspective, you can view them as, a lot of them, instead of sparks, I thought of sparks from fireworks. You can think of them as weeds that just pop up. They're parts of thought, but they don't unite the whole. And at the end, we will know because we must know. And that's something that E.O. Wilson is pretty consistent in talking about, working for. He's pretty consistent in talking about what he's working for and what he's trying to do and what he's trying to see. In the end, kind of to end my thoughts, I wanted to, again, talk to the people from Walk Away. It is the unity of knowledge. It's avoiding those idols of an undisciplined mind that drew you to Walk Away. One side looking at only the tribe, or only the cave, or only the theater, or only the marketplace. Those are idols. They're small parts of the whole. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the right or the left, both of those ideas have that path. But it's this order, it's the balance between order and chaos, between what we know and what we don't know, that is the true call of the Enlightenment. It's the unity of knowledge that is the true call of the Enlightenment. And thinking in these terms, and thinking in a Darwinian way, in terms of your evolutionary biology, is just as helpful as the great things that thinking in a reductionist way have brought us. I think in a lot of those ways there's a lot of answers to academic issues, to school issues, to political issues. But in the end, it's a reminder, in my opinion, that our problems are not political. Our problems are deeper than that, because our problem is still within our lack of understanding of ourselves and lack of understanding of human nature, which is, again, the purpose of E.O. Wilson writing this book, so we can have a better understanding of human nature. Okay, that's all for right now. Thank you for joining. We'll talk about chapter 4 next, which Dr. Wilson talks about a labyrinth, and he goes into some myth. All right, have a good day.